In the late summer of 1983, deep in the shadowy Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a series of unsettling events unfolded that would later be whispered about in the small, tight-knit community of Asheville. These events, documented in fragments and rumored in hushed voices, revolve around the disappearance of 28-year-old Emily Grayson, a seasoned hiker who ventured into Pisgah National Forest and was never seen again, or so the story goes. Emily was no stranger to the wilderness. She had grown up exploring the trails, mapping the terrain with her father, a retired park ranger. On the morning of August 12th, she set out alone on a 4-day hike, armed with her gear, journal, and a sense of invincibility. She had planned to follow the well-marked Black Balsam Knob Trail but, as locals later reported, was last seen veering onto an unmarked path near a grove of ancient oaks. That path wasn't on any map, but it had a reputation. The locals called it the Devil's Vein, an ominous name for what was, by all appearances, a simple deer trail. Yet stories about the trail abounded. Sudden storms, strange noises, and an unshakable feeling of being watched. Some who had wandered onto it claimed they had seen figures standing in the woods, motionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow them. Others spoke of hearing whispers in a language they couldn't understand. But Emily, pragmatic and skeptical, dismissed such tales as backwoods superstition. She stepped onto the trail without hesitation. 2 days later, Emily's boyfriend, Ben, grew concerned when she missed their scheduled check-in. By the 3rd day, he contacted the rangers who launched a search. At first, they found nothing unusual. Clear skies, no signs of a struggle, no misplaced gear. But as the search party moved deeper into the forest, a peculiar unease began to settle over the group. The woods were unnaturally quiet. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, not even the hum of insects. The air felt thick, heavy with something intangible. Then came the first discovery, Emily's journal, lying open on a moss-covered rock. The pages were damp but legible, and what they contained unsettled even the most seasoned rangers. Her entries began routinely, detailing the weather, the trail, and her thoughts. But on the 2nd day the tone shifted. August 13, 1983. Something feels off. I thought I saw someone ahead on the trail, but when I called out, they disappeared. Maybe it was just the light through the trees. August 14, 1983. I woke up last night to the sound of footsteps circling my tent. I'm sure it was just an animal, but it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard. It's hard to describe, like a dragging shuffle. I'm moving faster today, trying to make up time. The final entry was scrawled hurriedly, the letters jagged and uneven. August 15, 1983. There's something wrong with this place. I hear voices at night, but they're not speaking English. I saw the figure again, closer this time. I'm not imagining it. I can feel it watching me. I'm turning back tomorrow, but I don't know if I'll make it. The journal ended there. Chapter 3, The Stone Circle. 2 days later, searchers found Emily's campsite. Her tent was intact, her backpack untouched, but there was no sign of Emily. The only clue was a trail of footprints leading away from the site, deeper into the woods. The footprints were strange. Emily's boots, alongside others, barefoot, elongated, with toes that seemed unnaturally long. The trail led to a clearing surrounded by massive, moss-covered stones arranged in a perfect circle. The ground within the circle was bare, as if nothing had ever grown there. In the center lay Emily's compass, spinning wildly despite the still air. One of the rangers, a man named Frank, stepped into the circle and immediately staggered back, clutching his chest. "It's like pressure," he gasped. "Like the air is heavier in there." No one else dared enter. As the search dragged on, strange occurrences plagued the team. Radios malfunctioned, compasses spun uselessly, and at night, members reported hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. One by one, volunteers began to drop out, citing an overwhelming sense of dread. Ben refused to give up. On the 7th day, he ventured out alone, retracing Emily's path. When he didn't return, the remaining rangers followed his trail and found him near the stone circle, disoriented and mumbling incoherently. His clothes were torn, and his arms were covered in deep scratches, as if he'd clawed at himself. When he finally regained his senses, he spoke of shadows that moved against the light, figures that surrounded him, whispering his name. He claimed that Emily had called out to him, her voice faint and desperate, but when he turned, he saw only a silhouette with glowing eyes staring back. The search was officially called off after 2 weeks. Emily's disappearance was ruled as accidental, her body presumed lost to the dense wilderness. But those who had been part of the search never forgot the oppressive weight of the forest, the way it seemed to close in on them, alive and aware. Ben never recovered. He moved away, refusing to speak of what happened, but in the years that followed, hikers who ventured near the unmarked path reported strange phenomena: distant voices, flickering shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. One hiker, in 1991, claimed to have found Emily's compass at the edge of the stone circle. He took it as a souvenir, only to return it days later, leaving it at the ranger station with a note: "It's not hers anymore." To this day, the Devil's Vein remains unmarked on official maps, a place of local lore and whispered warnings. Some say Emily's spirit lingers there, trapped between the stones, her voice mingling with the whispers of whatever else dwells in that haunted forest. Others believe she was taken by something ancient, something the woods have harbored for centuries. But the most chilling accounts come from those who claim to have seen her, standing at the edge of the trees, her face pale and her eyes hollow, watching, waiting, as if deciding whether to let you leave or pull you in. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. Blackwood, a forgotten town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, had a reputation for strange occurrences. Its history, rife with unexplained disappearances and whispers of witchcraft, made it a magnet for urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill seekers. However, most who visited didn't return, their fates swallowed by the town's insidious past. This story, though, isn't about daring visitors but about a family who unknowingly moved into the heart of its darkness. In the summer of 1998, the Bennett family sought a fresh start after the loss of their youngest son Tyler. Sarah and Mark Bennett, along with their teenage daughter Emily, stumbled upon a seemingly perfect deal: a sprawling Victorian home at the edge of Blackwood, offered at an impossibly low price. Mark, eager to escape the reminders of Tyler's death, dismissed the warnings of locals about the property's cursed history. "Just superstitious nonsense," Mark assured Sarah as they signed the papers. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Emily spent her time exploring the forested trails nearby, while Sarah filled the home with warmth and decor, hoping to mask its eerie emptiness. But the silence of Blackwood grew oppressive, its stillness charged with an unnameable tension. One night, Emily awoke to the sound of whispers. She strained her ears but couldn't make out the words. The whispers seemed to come from her closet. Trembling, she flicked on her bedside lamp and the whispers ceased. Convincing herself it was a dream, she dismissed it, until it happened again the next night. This time, the whispers grew louder, almost urgent, as if trying to tell her something. When she told her parents, Mark brushed it off as imagination, but Sarah couldn't shake the unease creeping into her heart. She began noticing things herself: doors that were slightly ajar despite being closed, cold drafts in rooms with no windows, and faint sounds of footsteps echoing through the halls at night. While exploring the attic, Emily discovered an old leather-bound journal tucked inside a wooden chest. The name Abigail Hayes was scrawled on the first page. The entries detailed Abigail's life in the 1880s, filled with mundane musings, until they weren't. The latter pages spiraled into frantic handwriting, recounting sleepless nights, voices in the walls, and shadows with eyes that watched her. One entry sent chills down Emily's spine. "They know I've seen them. They want me to stay, to become part of them. I hear them calling my name when the house is quiet. I fear what will happen if I answer." The final entry was smeared with ink, almost unreadable. "Tonight they come. The whispers told me there is no escape. I am theirs." Emily brought the journal to her parents. Sarah's face went pale as she read, but Mark dismissed it as an old ghost story meant to scare children. However, that night, Sarah heard the whispers for herself. The family's nights turned restless. Mark became irritable and withdrawn, waking up drenched in sweat, claiming he dreamed of things crawling through the walls. Emily grew increasingly pale, complaining of fatigue and headaches. Sarah felt watched even when she was alone. One night, Sarah awoke to find Emily standing at the foot of their bed, her eyes glassy and unblinking. "Emily? What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Emily tilted her head. "They're here," she whispered before collapsing. Mark and Sarah rushed her to the hospital, but doctors found nothing wrong. As they drove back home, Emily's soft voice from the back seat chilled them. "We shouldn't have left. They don't like it when we leave." Desperate for answers, Sarah visited the town's archives. She discovered the house's gruesome history. Every family who had lived there had vanished without a trace. Abigail Hayes was the first documented disappearance, but she wasn't the last. The records grew more fragmented over time, as if people were trying to forget. Sarah also uncovered old folklore about the land Blackwood was built upon. Native tribes had called it the place where shadows feed, believing the area to be cursed by vengeful spirits. The Victorian house, erected directly atop the site, was thought to be a beacon for their malevolence. That night, the whispers grew deafening. Shadows danced unnaturally across the walls, pooling in corners before retreating. The family huddled together in the living room, clutching candles, their faces pale with terror. "We need to leave," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We can't," Emily replied. Her voice wasn't her own. It was deeper, older, layered with other voices. "They won't let us." The shadows began to coalesce into humanoid shapes, their eyes glowing faintly. They circled the family, closing in. Sarah remembered something from Abigail's journal, an unfinished ritual meant to banish the shadows. Abigail had failed, but Sarah had to try. Reciting the incantation she'd hastily copied from the journal, Sarah sprinkled salt in a circle around her family. The shadows hissed and recoiled, their forms writhing. For a moment it seemed to work, until Emily stepped outside the circle. "Emily, no!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. The shadows surged forward, engulfing the girl. Her screams echoed through the house, then stopped abruptly. The shadows dissipated, leaving only silence and the faint smell of burning. When authorities arrived days later, they found the house empty. No trace of the Bennetts remained, except for Abigail's journal, lying open on the floor. The final page now bore a new entry, written in Sarah's handwriting. Underscore the shadows took her. They are patient. They wait. And now they wait for you. The house still stands in Blackwood, its windows dark and uninviting. Occasionally, travelers report hearing faint whispers when passing by. None stay long enough to discover their source. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. The Harvest. In the remote plains of Kansas, there stands an abandoned farm known as the Grayson Homestead. Locals refuse to venture near, not out of superstition but because of the disturbing legacy of its final occupants. In 1932, the Grayson family vanished during harvest season, leaving their dinner untouched on the table and their fields unharvested. The only clue? A trail of deep, claw-like gouges leading from the house to the barn. Over the years, strange events plagued those who dared to investigate. Some claimed to hear whispers in the wind, others saw fleeting shadows moving among the dead crops. None stayed long, and those who did were never seen again. 80 years later, Evan and Claire Porter, city dwellers seeking a fresh start, purchased the Grayson homestead for a fraction of its worth. "This place is perfect," Claire said as they toured the property. "A little work and it'll be our dream home." Evan wasn't convinced. The house exuded a stifling stillness, the kind that made his skin crawl. But he couldn't bear to dampen Claire's excitement. After all, they needed this, a chance to rebuild after his recent layoff and the strain it had put on their marriage. The couple moved in mid-autumn, just as the leaves turned brittle and the air grew sharp. At first things went well. They cleaned out the overgrown fields and repaired the sagging barn. But unease crept in as they discovered peculiar remnants left by the Graysons. Weathered photographs of unsmiling children, a rusted side stained dark, and a journal whose last pages were smeared with an unidentifiable black substance. The whispers began a week later. At first they were faint, just the soft rustling of the cornfields at night. But soon they grew distinct, carrying fragments of words. "Leave?" Evan dismissed it as the wind. Claire claimed not to hear anything. But as days passed, the whispers intensified. Evan began waking at odd hours, drenched in sweat, with a distinct feeling of being watched. Once, while working in the barn, he turned to find the scythe he'd hung on the wall lying in the middle of the floor, its blade gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. "It's an old house," Claire said when he brought it up. "Things shift. Don't let it get to you." But Evan couldn't shake the dread growing in his chest. One evening, as Claire prepared dinner, Evan ventured into the fields to investigate the strange sounds that had haunted them for days. Armed with a flashlight, he stepped into the sea of withered cornstalks. The wind was unnaturally cold, biting through his jacket as if trying to push him back. Halfway through the field, he froze. Between the rows, he saw movement, a figure unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs jerking as it moved deeper into the crops. The flashlight beam flickered as Evan stepped closer, his heart pounding. He called out, but the figure vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving the cornstalks swaying violently in its wake. Evan ran back to the house, breathless. "There's someone out there," he gasped. But when Claire stepped onto the porch to look, the fields were still. That night, as they lay in bed, a slow, rhythmic creaking echoed through the house. It came from the attic. Unable to sleep, Evan retrieved the Grayson journal. He'd avoided reading it in detail, unsettled by its darkened pages. But now he needed answers. Flipping to the smeared pages, he deciphered what little remained legible. Underscore they come with the harvest, drawn to the blood of the land. Shadows that wear the faces of men. We tried to leave but they never let us. The barn, it begins in the barn. As Evan read, a low thud echoed from the direction of the barn. Claire stirred beside him, her face pale in the moonlight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. He nodded, clutching the flashlight. Together they ventured outside. The barn door creaked as they pushed it open, revealing a cavernous darkness. The air inside was heavy, tinged with the metallic stench of decay. Evan swept the flashlight across the space, its beam catching fragments of rusted tools, bales of hay, and something else. A pile of dirt in the center of the barn, freshly disturbed. "What is that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Before Evan could answer, the barn's doors slammed shut behind them. The flashlight flickered, plunging the space into darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, forming a cacophony of voices. "The harvest is here," they said in unison. Shadows peeled away from the walls, taking on grotesque forms. They had hollow eyes and jagged mouths that stretched unnaturally wide. One by one they turned toward Evan and Claire, advancing slowly. "Run!" Evan shouted, grabbing Claire's hand. They stumbled toward the doors, but the shadows moved faster, their elongated limbs clawing at the air. As the couple reached the doors, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. A shadowy figure larger than the rest emerged from the pile of dirt, its form writhing and shifting like smoke. "The land must be fed," it intoned in a voice that shook the barn's foundation. Evan turned to Claire, his face etched with determination. "Go," he said. "I'll hold them off." "No." Claire screamed, but he pushed her through the doors, slamming them shut behind her. Outside, Claire stumbled into the field, the barn's windows glowing with an otherworldly light. Evan's screams echoed across the farm, mingling with the guttural cries of the shadows. Then silence. The next morning, Claire was found wandering along the highway, her hair streaked with gray and her eyes hollow. She muttered incoherently about shadows and sacrifice, clutching the journal tightly to her chest. Authorities searched the farm but found no trace of Evan, or the barn. In its place was an empty field, the soil blackened and barren. To this day, travelers passing through the area report seeing a solitary figure standing in the field at dusk. Some say it's Evan, trapped forever in the harvest. Others claim it's something else, waiting for its next victim. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. And now, onto a tale that's as eerie as it is unforgettable. The Devil's Gorge, a sprawling canyon in the Pacific Northwest, had a reputation that preceded it. Known for its breathtaking beauty, it was also infamous for the number of hikers who vanished without a trace. For decades, search parties found no bodies, no gear, just the occasional chilling artifact. A torn piece of fabric, a scratched trail marker, or most disturbingly, recordings left behind on abandoned phones or cameras. What the recordings revealed defied logic, or belief. In October 2021, for friends, Kara, Mike, Julia, and Danny, set out to hike the gorge, ignoring the warnings plastered across forums and local guidebooks. "It's all urban legend," Danny scoffed as they packed their gear. "Yeah, people probably just got lost," Kara agreed. "We've got GPS, extra food, and plenty of gear. We'll be fine." The group was confident, seasoned hikers who had tackled challenging trails before. The first 2 days went as planned, crisp mornings, warm fires, and laughter echoing through the canyon's walls. But by the third day, they'd ventured deeper than most dared to go, into areas where the trail maps became vague and unreliable. "This must be where people get scared and turn back," Mike joked, pointing to the faded "No Entry" sign hammered into a tree. They pressed on, their laughter fading as the forest grew darker and the air colder. The first sign of trouble came that evening. As they set up camp, Julia noticed something strange about the surrounding trees. Their bark was covered in what looked like deep claw marks, as if something massive had raked them. "Bears?" she suggested, her voice wavering. "Too high up for bears," Danny replied, his brow furrowed. "And look, the grooves are too uniform. This wasn't an animal." That night, as they sat around the campfire, an eerie silence blanketed the forest. The usual chirps of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by a suffocating stillness. Then came the sound, a faint echo, almost like a human voice, calling from deep within the gorge. "Did you hear that?" Kara whispered. The group froze, listening. "Probably just the wind," Mike said, though his shaky tone betrayed his unease. But as the night wore on, the echoes grew louder, closer, and more distinct. They weren't random, they were words, their names. By dawn, the group was on edge. Kara, who'd been up most of the night, insisted they turn back, but Danny's pride got the better of him. "We've come too far," he argued. "Besides, whatever's out there, we're stronger together." Reluctantly, they continued, though the forest seemed to shift around them. Familiar landmarks vanished, and the GPS became useless, its signal scrambled. Julia swore they were walking in circles, but Danny insisted they were on track. Then they found the tent. It was old and torn, its fabric faded from years of exposure. Inside, they discovered a backpack filled with rotting supplies and a camera. Mike flipped it on, surprised to find it still held power. The last video chilled them to the bone. A man's frantic face filled the screen, his voice trembling. "They're watching me," he whispered. Behind him, shadows shifted, though the light was steady. "They want me to go deeper. Don't listen to the voices. Don't." The video cut off abruptly. Julia's hands shook as she dropped the camera. "We have to leave. Now." As they hurried back toward what they hoped was the trail, the echoes returned, louder and more insistent. They no longer just called their names but mimicked their voices, pleading and crying for help. "Danny. Wait, help me." Kara's voice rang out ahead. "I'm right here," Kara said, grabbing his arm. But the voice called again, identical. Danny's face turned pale. "Run," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The group broke into a sprint, but the forest seemed alive, its branches clawing at them, roots rising to trip their feet. The whispers were everywhere now, surrounding them. Then they saw the clearing open to the edge of the gorge, its sheer cliffs plunging into darkness. The voices grew louder, almost deafening. Shadows began to coalesce at the edges of the clearing, their forms humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their faces blank but for hollow pits where eyes should be. "We have to jump," Mike shouted, panic overtaking him. "Are you insane?" Kara screamed. But the shadows advanced, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble. Danny made the decision for them, grabbing Kara's hand and leaping over the edge. One by one, they followed, the air ripped from their lungs as they fell into the abyss. When Kara opened her eyes, she was alone. The gorge was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gray mist. Her friends were nowhere to be seen, but the whispers remained, circling her like predators. Months later, hikers found her backpack at the edge of the gorge, along with a single recording. It was her voice, trembling and broken. "They're still here. They're always here. Don't come looking. Don't." The recording ended with a scream. Authorities closed the area indefinitely, citing safety concerns. But locals know the truth. The gorge doesn't let its victims go. It only sends warnings to lure the next. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.